about 5 minutes late.
Okay. And
I mean,
Chris, I did send you an email. I don't know if you saw it just before I came on.
Okay.
all right. Well, we are live for the GEO monthly live stream, number 15, I believe. And we are very fortunate this month to be joined by one of our core GEO members, one of our geodes, as we say, uh, Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nembhard. Yeah, so glad that you could join us today. And
Yeah,
yeah,
happy to do it.
it's and it's a big year for worker co-ops in the U.S. It's the 20th anniversary this year of the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops, and I think the conference that kind of started that all happened 20 years ago, just last month. So
Right.
we're going to discuss that. So I think I will just turn it over to you, Jessica, since you were there for all the events. And
So yeah, I'm happy to kind of recap, and then I think Chris and I were going to dialogue a little bit about it. But I did write, from an economy of hope to the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops. I tried to give a perspective, both as a GEO member and as somebody who was in the middle of things. I guess you could say I was in the middle of things. I didn't actually help to compile an economy of hope. I was just joining GEO at the time that they were doing it. I was there when an economy of hope came out, and I was there working with Bob Stone on starting the Eastern Conference for Workplace Democracy, and from there moving into getting us focused on a national conference and a national federation. So what my point was in looking back is for us to remember that this was a bottom up, a real grassroots organizing activity getting to a national federation. It was not anything top down. It wasn't something that major US co-op organizations were focused on. It wasn't a mandate from the international associations. It was really worker co-ops from the bottom up who had already started working together. No Boss in the Bay Area had been doing it for like 10 years already, meeting together. And they, a few years before we started with the Eastern Conference, they were doing Western worker conferences. And the notion was really, one, there's so few of us. Let's make sure we know each other, can talk to each other and support each other. And two, being worker co-ops, right, it always helps to find out best practices, what other groups are doing and why and how. So again, No Boss kind of started it with their local network and then doing their regional Western networking, getting worker co-op members to come talk to each other about the needs, about what was happening, and about what was successful for them. So really peer training, peer communication, right, working together. Bob Stone, as he saw GEO putting together this directory, realized that a lot of the groups we were finding, especially that were not in the Bay Area and the Northwest of the US, didn't know each other. We barely knew who they were, right? And so we put together this listing, and basically what we did was, it was word of mouth. Sometimes people call it the snowball effect, right? You talk to one group and you ask what other ones they know of, that kind of thing. And then we literally like called phone numbers, looked at websites to try to find out which groups were still existing, all that kind of stuff. And so that's why we say it was an annotated directory, because we tried to put as much up-to-date information as we had about the organization in there, and really didn't list anything that we couldn't that we couldn't contact, right, because it was supposed to be a list of how to contact people. But as I said, but then Bob started talking to GEO about, okay, so now we have this whole listing. What are we going to do with it? And he actually literally volunteered to be the one to start going around to some of these places and bring everybody together. And so that was, again, he also talked to No Boss and went to the Western Conference to see what they were doing, asked their advice, and then started going other places in the South and the East. I'm not sure if he went to the Midwest or not, but the Midwest started organizing itself also. So again, the excitement for me was when Bob asked me if I was interested in working on this. I had just actually recently started working at the University of Maryland, College Park in the Department of Africana Studies, but also helping to co-found and start the Democracy Collaborative. So it was a great project for the Democracy Collaborative to get a handle on to help us organize an Eastern Conference. And of course, we worked with the NCBA, National Cooperative Business Association, CLUSA, the Cooperative League of the United States is its official name, but it operates under National Cooperative Business Association. That was a natural partner, and they were also very helpful in pulling money together for us. So I don't know if I should stop there and you guys should start asking me questions, or you want me to do more reflections on the actual events.
So I think it's been brought up in Geo before, the idea of someone who goes around and trying to connect localities and stuff. Do you feel like that's something that that maybe we don't see enough of today? That they kind of like help catalyze this? That maybe something that should have kept happening that maybe doesn't happen as much as it should today, given like how things have grown since.
Yeah, we used to call Bob Stone our traveler, the geo traveler, right? And that notion that he, because even, geo, even though we sort of had a base in Stillwater, Pennsylvania, we were always kind of a virtual, a national group. We did try to come together several times a year, but we often operated, remotely. And so this notion and this idea and this practice that Bob had to really go around and meet people and talk to them, right, was pretty incredible. He and his wife, Betsy Bowman, were members of GEO. And I know Betsy went with him sometimes, but this notion that we should really talk to each other, right, that the person to person connections were really important. And I think, yeah, in some ways we've lost it, right? Because we kind of talk about professionalism and things like that and worry more about, whether we fit into the nonprofit industrial complex or something. And we forget that co-ops are really about relationships and people, right? And how important it is to really connect with each other, talk to each other, be in each other's presence, learn that way as much as from reading about somebody's website or whatever. So I do think it would be nice. And I don't know, Chris, I sort of feel like you're doing some of that, not maybe for Geo, but in your own life, the way you live your life, you're kind of a traveler, aren't you? In that sense.
I think so. I think there is something that happens that's kind of like that as a result of me having to go back and forth the way that I do. I feel like someone who does that is as well, maybe even more, is Esther West.
Esther West, yeah,
She's
you're
like the
right.
way she goes around and builds solidarity among people and connects people. And I don't think it's I don't I think it's really good what she's able to do. I know that some people kind of just want to connect anyone to each other, and a lot of times that doesn't work out. But I feel like the way that Esther does it is really healthy. Um, at least a lot of the connections that I've seen that she's been able to make from traveling so many places, which also is which in my opinion it's also a big sacrifice too, or it
Right.
can be a big sacrifice the way people do that. So that's why, like, if it's something that should become something that should continue, I think people should be more organized about how we do it. That way, it's like a fairer, the way we can do it fairly, or in a way where people are not sacrificing too much. because it's kind of painful
Right.
to be
Yeah,
away
we
from your
need the
home. And
balance, right? People need the balance, and more of us need to do it, right? So, I love that shout out to Esther West. She's one of my favorite people, and we've done some projects together. So I totally agree she's doing it. But you're right, it is a sacrifice. But that's, I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but that's also why I was so excited and intrigued about this notion of local worker co-op associations like No Boss, and then eventually the Valley Alliance in the Pioneer Valley of Massachusetts. Boston has Workin, right? Madison has MadWorks, because in a way, having those local coalitions, local organizations was a way, and in fact, there was sort of an initial idea that all these locals would have their own kind of convenings. MadWorks now has their rendezvous, right? But the notion was all these local groups should have their rendezvous. Those rendezvous would then feed into regional conferences, right? And then the regional conferences would lead into the national. And the assumption was that not everybody could come or afford to go to a national, right? Especially if it wasn't in their region, but they all should be able to go to local meetings, and they all should be able to hopefully go to regional meetings. And so that in some ways, having groups of people traveling together and meeting each other, right? As opposed to it having to be one person trying to carry the weight of keeping everybody together. So I think that was also part of this, kind of the road to national. And then it wasn't supposed to be an end road. It was supposed to be a continuing practice of different levels of people getting together, so that we didn't have to depend on just one traveler who was going to sacrifice, what they were doing in their local and what they were doing with their family and that kind of thing. So for me, I think that's still maybe something we should be aspiring to, is trying to figure out how to get more locals and more local activity that can then keep feeding into different levels, so that we can keep engaging more and more people, talking together, learning from each other.
Yeah, I've thought and I know we've talked about this maybe on a live stream previously, Chris, about like how nice it would be to have some infrastructure for this kind of thing. Like as the example, where we've got connections with people, the Mariposa Housing Co-op in San Francisco, and they're like have an open invitation. Any of our people are there. We've got a place to stay, and it would be so nice and facilitate this kind of travel and coordination that we're talking about. If like the local groups could also have like figure out some guest rooms and stuff for people, because I think that would be great if you're trying to start a worker co-op, or you're a new worker co-op in some particular industry, and say, I want to go to Madison and visit the people who've been doing this for 20 years, and it'd be great if I didn't have to pay for a hotel room or something, and have some kind of organization to kind of help facilitate the logistics of that kind of thing.
Yeah, NASCO used to kind of do that. I guess they still do. I just haven't been to one of their conferences, but they always had solidarity housing at their conferences. So some of the housing co-ops would have rooms or couches. Other members would put somebody up. So even before I think that couch surfing started happening, NASCO was already doing things like that to make sure their conferences were accessible and affordable. But I think you're right, trying to figure out what those learning journeys might be, and how, right, how to make sure people can go on them. Because that's the other thing I think I like, instead of just one traveler, or each organization having just one traveler, because I think the more people who learn and interact with other people, the better. It's not always as effective if only one member of the co-op or one member of the group goes and meets all these other people and learns about it, right? It's kind of better if a few people from the group, or as many people from the group, can have these experiences. We tried to do, even GEO, right? Tried to do a little bit with our quarterly meetings, right? We started thinking about them as being a chance to go to different places and set aside two evenings to actually meet other people who were in those places, so that as a group, as GEO, we could start meeting other cooperators, other worker co-ops, other movement people, and be strategic about where our meetings were. Then, COVID happened, and also we never really raised a lot of money to pay to bring people in person, whatever. But I think it's still a good strategy that we might think about again. And I think we're trying to think about that for our next retreat, right? Going somewhere where we can, where several people can afford to get to, and we can meet the people who are doing stuff in that place.
Yeah, I feel like that kind of system would benefit so many other parts of the solidarity economy. But maybe it already exists and we're just not aware of it. But I remember many years ago, someone had made a really great comment in it was a Discord of the Autonomous Tenant Union Network, where they said, "Hey, someone basically said, can we get better at developing like a good way for like couch surfing?" Um, and and they were responding to something that I have been mentioning to locals too. Um, because I've noticed that a lot of people don't even want to do that anymore. A lot of people have so many negative experiences. And to me, some negative experiences are okay, but as long as we're kind of like learning from them and getting better about it. But I've seen all sorts of scenarios where people just don't want to do it anymore. And supposedly that came up too last year in Chicago, that a lot of people who had a couch to spare or something for a lot of the Venezuelans who were coming in and who were homeless. Like they wanted to do it, but they had already been burned so many times, and they didn't want to get burned again. And I totally get it. If we can get if we can figure that out, I think we'll benefit a lot of sectors of society, a lot of struggles. Um, rules of the road, rules of travel, and then there's also the pro-indigenous aspect too. That's one reason why I don't really travel that much too, because I I, I want to be in solidarity with the other native folks, and um, I kind of feel like traveling without actively being able to meet with other native folks and talk about like the struggles that we're going through. Um, I feel like not being able to do that is a very disempowering thing. Um, anyway, that's one thing that I think about. But yeah, what else you got, Josh or Jessica?
You were the one with the
Well,
list of questions, Chris. I
I could keep talking about the experiences. So, um, I was very intimately involved in starting the Eastern Conference for Workplace Democracy. And the first year, 2002, we weren't really sure if anyone would come. I think actually, Chris, you had a question about something I said about it, about our attempt to get worker owners to be as involved as possible in the planning and execution of the conference, because that was the model we had from the Western worker co-ops, right? In fact, Bob literally asked their organizer, for her, I don't know what you call it, her files or her timesheets about how she organized the Western Conference and that kind of stuff. And all through the Western Conference, there's lots of, I would guess mandates is too strong a word, but lots of intentions to make sure that people making decisions about what content to have on the conference, making decisions about where to hold it, what to do, were worker owners themselves. So it was very much a bottom up, and the people most affected, right, the worker owners kind of making decisions. On the East Coast, we didn't have as many activist worker co-ops who were interested in doing this kind of planning, and they weren't as old or entrenched, and so they didn't have like extra money to put in. um, but we did have a lot of support organizations who were interested and excited and involved, right? So we tried to figure out a way to utilize the fact that we were able to raise some decent money. We had a lot of volunteer and staff from support organizations who had time to put in, but yet we still wanted to hear those voices from worker co-ops. So we ended up with a kind of bifurcated structure. We had a planning program committee run by Carol Hack from SACO, Southern Appalachian Co-op something. I don't remember what SACO stands for. Frank Adams, a sort of famous worker owner developer, and he wrote a book on how to start a worker co-op. He was one of the co-founders of that, and Carol was one of the I don't know if she was co-director at that point or what, but anyway, she knew a lot of the co-ops, especially in the Southeast, and was able to pull them together, not as often as the logistical planning committee met, but she was able to pull them together, get their ideas for content, what kind of workshops, what kind of best practices, what kind of questions they had that they wanted the conference to cover. And so that's how we did it, kind of separated the content out, and bothered those people less. And then the sort of fundraising, logistics, all that other stuff, those of us who had other jobs and who had capacity and that kind of thing handled that side. But we also talked about how to get people to actually attend the conference, because again, a lot of the worker co-ops we knew in the East, and we did the East Coast from Northeast to Southeast and all the way over to Ohio. So a little bit into the Midwest was our, actually anyone was invited, but that was kind of the boundaries in terms of who we were trying to attract. And so we also realized that some of these fledgling and small worker co-ops were reluctant to send anyone to a regional conference, again, because both of the cost to get there, but also the cost of losing a worker member's time, right? If you have a 5 or 10 person or even 20 person co-op, having someone gone for 2 or 3 days is a real sacrifice, right? So we also thought about the Western actually paid people for their planning time and paid presenters for their time. We tried to do the model without doing that, unless it was a worker owner who needed their time paid for. And we thought about trying to figure out stipends, but nobody could totally agree on it. And so we never really came up with a foolproof way to get more worker owner participation. But we did start to raise money for scholarships, both registration scholarships and travel scholarships. And so we did pretty well. We had an auction that was specifically to raise money for scholarships. We asked some of the sponsors to specifically put money in for scholarships. And I think that practice is still going on. But that was another way that we tried to figure out how to help people. And then we at least tried to talk about, right, what does it mean for your co-op to either have to shut down so all of you can come, or for you to lose, some work for a day or two, and, how that would look, and what we should do about that. And as I said, I don't think we ever really came up as a community or as a movement with a foolproof way, but we do have some stopgap things. And then I guess with after COVID, with some virtual meetings, maybe we did better with people being able to attend virtually and not having to pay to get somewhere. But again, that was also why we liked the idea of starting with local organizations, because at least people could participate at their local level, even if they couldn't make it to a regional conference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's definitely something I think we need to get back to. I would like to see a lot more, like not just regional, but like municipal, small, or like for a small geographic area, events to bring just people interested in co-ops together. Because I think personally, I feel like there's too much emphasis on the big yearly conferences, and there should be that are, as you say, there's a certain like exclusivity to them. There's certain barriers that are in place. You have to be able to often travel long distance. You got to be able to afford to stay someplace. And besides missing your work and all that. So, having more events that are smaller and that take less overhead and less planning time, more of like the open conference kind of style of organizing, maybe to help with that, and just and more on the local level. I think that's something that's really needed right now. Yeah. Remember that
like
we always wanted to do that,
Right.
Yeah, I feel like I've seen that dynamic in other orgs too, where like the so-called national, and the United States is humongous. It's humongous. It's like this. There's many countries can fit in the United States, and those smaller countries, they do like a national thing for them every year is not even sustainable, and then we're trying to do that in this humongous continent. Um, I feel like that kind of thing, the yearly gathering on such a wide scale I feel like it produces like nation state sociology and consciousness and like dynamics and sensibilities. I've seen it in other orgs too, and I usually kind of like refuse to participate. Um, I don't, and it's really hard. I've seen where this happens in the industrial workers of the world, where you have like a group that's new, they want to affiliate, and there's like all this pressure to participate in things outside of the local, but you have like that very little people power, and to take on all these responsibilities for like a well established local, it might not be much, but for these groups that are so new, like they can't really spare that much time to even like read all the things that are being brought to the convention and all that. It's yeah, it's something I think about quite a bit. Um,
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely benefits to doing something at the national level, right? Because that's where you can sort of, there can be one voice, especially if you're trying to get legislation passed and things like that, right? You have a chance for there to be one voice for everybody to hear the same stuff and participate in the same way, right? There's ways that the national can be supportive of the locals. Um, so I can see both sides, but I think what we're talking about, and we're grassroots economic organizing, so we're thinking about, right, what's the most benefit for the most people, right? And I think, I agree, it would be great if we could bring back more local activity, people getting people involved at the local level. I think the alternating years, is still okay for national. But I'm also thinking about the model of the right to the city. They actually raise enough money to pay for every member organization to bring 2 or 3 people to their national. I don't know exactly how they afford it. I don't, right? But I do know because one of the organizations I work with has a program with them. And I think it was a member leader, a grassroots organizer, and maybe a staffer or something all basically get their trip paid, including lodging and travel, everything, um, which is really great. And I can't remember I don't know if they do annual meetings that way or every other year or what. But anyway, it seems like there's ways to do both, right? To get people at a national, because it is nice to have everybody kind of together, learning the same things, advocating for specific things and stuff. But I'm definitely one of those people who I think the most impact happens at the local, at the smaller level, where more people can be involved. People aren't as worried about whether they're have to travel. They still can either stay home or be nearby, that kind of thing. The other thing we did make sure was to have childcare, right? So even for the people who could come, we made sure that there was good quality, high quality childcare, and that children and young people were invited to be there. Because again, we wanted to make sure people with families didn't feel like they had to come without their families, or that they didn't have coverage for their, because I think that's also important to not see people as individuals, but as parts of families and parts of organizations. So figuring out how to, how to facilitate their time, energy as people connected to other groups of people, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like it's definitely not an either or situation. I mean, I've been to a couple national conferences. They're amazing. They're great. I do enjoy them. It's wonderful to be able to meet people that you've only heard about or read about their co-ops, or never have heard about their co-ops, and to get to hear about them for the first time is great. And to share ideas with people, and to just be surrounded by so many people who are like-minded. Especially for me, being from a pretty rural place, it's nice to be around a whole lot of like-minded people. I don't usually get the opportunity, but it's I guess, kind of to reiterate, or maybe to expand a little bit on my thought before, with the national conferences versus more local gatherings, and even with national organizations versus more local ones, it seems to me like it's akin to the difference between like high touch and low touch cooperative development, right? Like at a national conference and with a national organization, you can get that kind of low touch support and help, but it's like it's only going to reach a few people because you have one organization, and as Chris pointed out, we're a massive country with a lot of people, and then you're only going to be able to, like, limited in time, right? You're only going to be able to provide any kind of support while people are there, and so it's like we need both of those, and it feels to me like, because this national level stuff is more sexy, for lack of a better term, is just more exciting and seems like more important, that gets a lot of the energy and focus from people, and that I would like personally for kind of see a shifting of more of that time and energy being put into a lot more local things, and kind of have the subsidiarity like idea that the larger the organization, kind of the looser and less important it should be. But anyway,
Yeah, good
Chris.
point. Sorry, I know
Okay.
Chris has another question, but he said his mic isn't working. Oh no, Matt. Oh, Matt's here, but no
Yeah,
mic.
Matt's over. Yeah, he's sitting in the green room, but
Oh,
his
okay.
devices are not connecting. So
Yeah, sorry. Before Chris asks his next question, I did want to say one more thing about the importance of the U.S. having a national federation of worker co-ops. Um, Worker co-ops have been the smallest sector in the U.S. co-op movement, and they really had almost no voice. In fact, part of my thank you speech when I was inducted into the Co-op Hall of Fame was to mention that I hoped and that I thought I saw the U.S. co-op movement not being as siloed as it used to be, and recognizing more the worker co-ops and some of the urban co-ops and stuff. When I first joined, there were very few urban co-ops, or very little talk about urban co-ops. There was very little talk about people of color in the co-op movement, people of color co-ops, and the sectors were totally isolated from each other. And the worker co-op sector was like, people had no respect for it. And so it was important for the U.S. to get the worker co-ops together so that we did have an official sector. And so we did have a voice, we did have a say. Now we actually have reps on the National Cooperative Business Association's board, right? We're represented in SACOPA, the International Association for Worker Co-ops. And we're able to connect better with, like, the Canadian Federation and other groups. But we finally were able to be recognized. And then the really fantastic thing is, now by 2024, the worker co-op sector is one of the fastest growing of the U.S. co-op sectors, which is really amazing, because some of the other sectors have actually, like ag, have been waning. But, purchasing co-ops, worker co-ops, actually food co-ops are now on the rise again. And so it's interesting, the co-ops that didn't always have as much representation and as much status are now actually the ones, again, they're more kind of grassroots based, and they're growing faster. And the worker co-ops, right, are predominantly actually women of color, right? Most of the new worker co-ops are growing among women of color, which is also really interesting.
Oh, okay. So, what do you know today that you wish you knew then that may have had a bigger impact in you know, how things have developed? That's okay if it's a brain buster. So.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm trying to think about, I guess I'm gonna think out loud and answer it in pieces. I had no idea that women of color would be the fastest growing people to start doing worker co-ops. I don't know how I would have changed if I knew that, except that maybe I would have argued even more strongly for inclusion and racial justice in the co-op movement. But to say be more strong about it, I was a pretty strong advocate for that from the beginning. And so, first the lone voice, and then, I continued, and even actually at the founding meeting for the Federation, when we were talking about what the organization should look like and the initial governance and stuff, I actually proposed an amendment that got passed, but was hard to implement, though I think now it seems to be a moot point. But I introduced an amendment that said, because we were talking about how to elect delegates, and so I think there was supposed to be a certain number of at-large delegates, a certain number of regional delegates, and I said that we should always hold at least one of the elected spots for a diverse candidate, and that the best way to do that was to see how the count went, right? If we had 5 spots open, um, to fill the first 4 with the highest elected number, right? Because we were still going with majority rules, which actually now I don't even agree with that. I believe in ranked voting or whatever. But anyway, at the time we were still talking about majority rules. So I said, okay, if we have 5 openings, we could fill the first 4 with the highest votes, right? With the people who got the highest votes. But the last one, the new board should look at the rest of the candidates, and from among the candidates who had high votes but not the highest votes, they should figure out what was missing on the board. So if if the 4 votes were all white men or whatever, they might need a black woman, or if there were 2 women and 1 man, but nobody all older over 50, then they need a youth. Anyway, they should, look at their composition, look at what they were missing in terms of diversity, and then from the other candidates who people had voted for. So I wasn't asking them to just bring in anybody, but of the candidates who people had voted for, if somebody fit one of the gaps, they should move that person up higher than the 5th person who got the 5th highest votes. So I was trying to figure out a way that we could still do, the majority rules kind of thing, but be very intentional about making sure we looked at what kind of diversity the board had and what kind of diversity it was missing, that kind of thing. I think, I never actually was on the board. I was hoping Audra would be here with us because she was actually on that first board. So I don't know exactly what happened, but I do know there were a few years, like 5 years later, someone came back and asked me how that clause was supposed to work, because they felt like it wasn't really being implemented. And then they tried to implement it, and it did, things got a little bit better. And then slowly, I mean, now it's amazing, right? The 2024 board is what, majority people of color, and maybe majority women. I can't remember that part. But anyway, so it doesn't seem like they officially have that problem anymore, though, again, my notion of diversity included sort of age, ableism issues, right? gender and sexual orientation, as well as race and ethnicity. So there may still be some issues that need to be looked at, but the organization now is at least practicing some language justice with everything translated into Spanish, and they do seem to have a majority people of color board of directors. I'm not sure about the staff, but anyway, so I'm still trying to answer your question of what I know now that I would have done differently. I guess I might have pushed for even more strongly to do a more progressive kind of governance structure and voting, right? I was kind of being conservative with my just take one slot and try to make sure it was diverse. On the other hand, maybe it doesn't matter as much because it sort of worked out. So that's one thing. I think the second thing is, especially even just from our conversation now, I think maybe I would have suggested that we have a national conference every 3 years, that we have 1 year or 2 years in between, making sure there's lots of local connections and rendezvous and activities. And then I still believe in regional. So, every other year, or every other third year, or whatever, doing the regionals, but maybe making enough time for a year or two of more local stuff to make sure that people really participate before they end up going to a national conference. So I think that kind of thing. And then I guess the final thing that I've really learned over the years is how important peer-to-peer learning is. And again, this bottom-up stuff, I feel like a broken record, but it's also what we believe at GEO, right? I think even in the training and development, we're so worried about being respected and respectable that we don't think about, even in regular pedagogy. The newest pedagogy is now talking about how important it is for dialogue, learning from our peers, and that's how people learn the best. So then our movement should be doing that too, right? So somehow ensconcing in our movement the importance of peer-to-peer learning, working, talking together, dialoguing together from the bottom up, that we really need, that wasn't just something you do to start until you get bigger or get a national, but it's something that we have to do all the time and practice and honor all the time. So I guess that would be the other thing.
I don't know if we've ever talked specifically about this in geospace, but how do y'all feel about learning where like everybody has something meaningful to contribute, even if they don't have a certificate, an
Oh,
educator's
absolutely.
certificate,
Right.
educator's degree,
Yeah.
boot camp degree or whatever?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Josh.
Oh, I was going to say like a asset mapping or something like that. Like, that's that's a big one.
Yeah, well, you can learn what everybody's good at and they can share what they're good at. But also when I talk about peer education, peer training, or education or training, in my book, I talked about how most of the Black co-ops that I found information about how they started with some kind of study group or whatever, and how important this internal education is. And a lot of people asked me, they were like, oh, you mean formal, like a formal course in co-ops or whatever? And that's really not what I mean. I mean, that's fine, and some groups actually got that far, but I'm really talking about, right, learning from each other and everybody learning together. So that there isn't this sort of hierarchy of knowledge, because I don't, co-ops really, especially self-managed co-ops, don't work well when there's a hierarchy of knowledge, right? We're supposed to all have the same information. There's supposed to be transparency, right? And then if we don't all have the same information, there's supposed to be a sharing, right? So if committees hold certain information, those committees at least are decentralized among themselves, but they also share what they're doing, what they're learning with the rest of the group through the way that the committees can work with each other. So so it's not about who's got the most training or who has a certificate, even though, Dawn, the Democracy at Work Network, which was doing peer-to-peer, did have a certification. but they had that more as a way to help train each other in best practices for how to do peer-to-peer training, right? I don't think it was supposed to be exclusionary or gatekeeping for people. And I think some of their members could still do co-op development even if they hadn't finished the certificate process, if I remember correctly. So yeah, so when I talk about education, I'm talking about recognizing the knowledge that we all have and the skills we all have, and how can we share those and talk to each other and talk through the information to get to even better practices and decisions.
Yeah. And yeah, definitely amen to all that. I'll repeat. I know I mentioned this before. I was watching recently a webinar with some folks doing like co-op development among native tribes and indigenous folks, and one of the women was she got pretty passionate, saying, you know, one of the things we really dislike about the whole nonprofit world is having to go there and like be like, oh, we're so helpless, please, you know. You know, you have to like go there and be like the most, you know, pathetic, miserable people. And she's like, we don't do that. Our first thing we do, and we, you know, you go and you start asking people, okay, what do you know how to do? What can we, you know, what assets, what knowledge, what resources do we have? And working from that, you know, and recognizing that, yeah, there's lots of power that we already have. And I think it's a sneaky way of disempowering people. It's making them think that, oh, you need somebody from higher up the totem pole to fix things for you or help you out.
The only reason that you need help is because you can't do stuff, when sometimes you can do it, but you just need more resources to do it even better, right?
Yeah. You just need somebody to give you the idea that, hey, you can do it, and you know, here's the way that other people have.
Cooperative Economics for Women, that was operating out of Boston when I first got excited about co-ops. That's the first thing they did. They had a whole skills checklist or something, right, to get people realizing that they knew how to do stuff, right? Even if they did their own home plumbing or whatever, just put down whatever skills you have, right? And then they did it also partly to help group people to think about what kind of co-op to start. But it was also, as you know, and they had a long, like almost a 2-year process of developing people, because they wanted to start with making people see that they already had assets, then helping people to see, well, what kinds of assets would they want to do a co-op with. They also talked to people about money right early on, right? Who do you even feel comfortable talking to money about, sharing money with, that kind of stuff, which is also a really interesting question, because especially in this capitalist world, we aren't that comfortable talking and sharing money, talking to people about money, right? So they, you know, got on top of that really right away. And then they later, after all that kind of information, they got people talking about how to start a business, what kind of business to start, what does it mean to be a co-op, right? They, you know, but they spent months just getting people in the right frame of mind to think both about themselves as active people who had something to give, and to think about our relationship with money, and if they had to change their attitudes about money, start to do it before they get into the co-op kind of thing. So it's really interesting. I don't know if they ever finished it. I was encouraging them to write a manual because they had such a unique process. But I think they folded before they were able to get their manual done. But they had started a few co-ops. And they had done some workshops at some of the early Eastern conferences for workplace democracy.
Yeah, I think one of the ways that I found out about GEO was because Jim or Josh here, out of the Madison Regional Rendezvous, they were part of the folks who were encouraging more peer support.
Right.
And and one of the things that I felt that Jim said was that kind of like over the years, a lot of that peer support, it seems to have been lost, or it wasn't kind of matching what existed when there was this big push that led to what became the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops. And so the Co-op Connection Network that came out of the Regional Rendezvous was an attempt to try to um, intensify peer support. And I think this year we decided to meet a lot less because we weren't seeing um, the peer, we weren't like, how do you say, catalyzing that peer support by the approaches that we were doing. But um, we decided to meet less frequently, and I think one of the things that we said is like, we don't think the peer support doesn't exist. It probably does exist. We're just not seeing it. We're not tapped into it, and so we should probably be a little more mindful about like, how is the peer support happening that we're not aware of, and maybe that's the way to kind of like learn from that, and maybe that'll be the way to take
Yeah.
it to the next level.
It might be
Um,
under the radar. I think it might be under the
mhm.
radar. Also, I imagine the peer support that happens is a little bit exhausting. And so maybe those people don't have time to also talk about it or be in an organization about it or something. But I do have to say, did we publish it yet? But we have an article by John McNamara about the beginnings of Dawn, the Democracy at Work
Yeah.
Network, which was the peer support, and its evolution, and then how it got under the wing of the U.S. Federation, and the U.S. Federation kind of dismantled it in order to keep doing their own technical assistance, which they say still includes peer support. And now I see they also have a peer support. What do they call their committees or their circles? Uh, Anyway,
Um,
so they still have a
councils.
council. Yeah, one of their councils is still about peer support. So they haven't totally dropped it, though they didn't seem to think they needed Dawn anymore. And maybe, it is because it's hard to get the people who are doing the peer work to keep meeting together and working together. So we should kind of think about, I mean, it might go back to that original question I had. Remember, I said when we started the Eastern Conference, how do you get worker owners themselves to have this extra movement building and affiliation time, right, when they're so busy with their own work? We might have to revisit, right, what does that mean, or how do we recognize peer support if it's already happening but it's more under the radar now. But I think it's important to keep it on the table because, as I said, I do think people learn best that way.
Mhm.
um, and so figuring out how we can catalyze that again in our movement in a way that makes sense, right? So I don't know, maybe we need another survey asking people what would help in that area or what supports are needed for that area or something.
Yeah.
Jim had a really interesting reflection when we talked about the idea of like under the radar stuff. Well, under the radar peer support. He said there's this like really old co-op that's still active, and that they usually don't respond to him about anything except for when he's talking about helping out another co-op or like
Mm,
a group of people who are trying to
mm,
start a co-op. He says they always respond to that, but anything else, like trying to get them involved in other stuff,
right,
they won't.
right.
So that's a really interesting, cool story that stuck out from that conversation.
Yeah, yeah. No, it is interesting. And how where people put their energies, right? As we said, there's finite energy.
Hmm.
And when you're already, heavily involved in certain things, right? You may
Yeah.
not put your energy other places. Um,
Yeah. And I mean, maybe that's. I mean, I know there are ongoing efforts to restart something like Dawn, and I hope they continue, like the Democracy at Work Network. Some kind of more formalized peer support, just for and Dawn was a national network, which is great again for places like where I'm at, where if you want to do an agriculture co-op, there are people who know what they're you can talk to you. But if you want to do a worker co-op, you're kind of SOL for people who really know much around here. And so having having people who have been there and done that and who do that to talk to, in places that are maybe not quite so populous or don't have quite the co-op density, I think is really would be really useful. But given to the little story from Jim, like maybe the problem is trying to go at it like all at once, right? We need to like have some system like an 800 number. You call with your problem. It's like, okay. And then, you get connected with the appropriate co-op. So it's not like we're asking the worker owners to be part of this nebulous thing. Sometimes like we have a very specific question for you right now, answer it, yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me also of, there are a lot more websites now that people can go with specific or early questions, right? There's a lot of websites that will tell you how to start this or sample bylaws or this kind of stuff. The US Federation's website, we've got some stuff. And then there's ed.coop that we're a part of, right? That helps to direct people. So it may be that people, that the initial assumption is that there's enough information out there, and maybe we need to get the communication out there that there's nothing like one-to-one, voice-to-voice, person-to-person, right? It's not good enough just to get the information off of the web or whatever, right? There needs to be some kind of follow-up. You need somebody, one person or a group to talk to or to, and and so maybe that's also the conversation or the way that a group like GEO could promote this more is by showing how, right, the co-ops that really get to talk to other people and talk to each other and visit other co-ops and stuff really are even stronger.
Yeah, it reminds me of how in the tenant support, in my experience, I discovered that a lot of people, they will like just read the law on their own and they try to fight the landlord on their own. But without the experience of others, it can easily like turn against them, like depending on depend on so many factors. And that is a message that I try to put out there, but it is hard. But I think you're right. Yeah, there should be, make it like cool to put that imaging out there. Like, we need that peer support. Well, I don't know what catchy slogan, but a lot of times catchy slogans are not good. Without intermediaries, direct support. I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting to me. Because I'm not like that at all, and a lot of people I've interacted with have been are always super excited to actually talk to a real person, because all of the text can be overwhelming and the videos can get boring, and it's always nice to talk to somebody. But with the way the culture has been going, I guess it makes sense that maybe a lot more people would think, oh well, all the information's right here at my fingertips, so don't need to go anyplace, don't need to talk to anybody to figure this stuff out, which it's kind of a anti-cooperative way to go about it. But
okay, you know what the words might be that'll be really helpful? Free. Because I think that's the other thing and that's why I like the peer support, the idea of the peer support more, because like everywhere else that I've seen, I'm like, I'm not going to pay for that, especially, and I'm not going to encourage my neighbors. And we talked about this with Josh, right? That they stand the most to lose if the effort isn't successful. Why are they going to pour all this money in it that they already don't have?
Right. I'm going to pay the developer and they're going to take the money. And then when the co-op fails, I'm out the money that I put into the co-op and the money we paid the developer. It's like, okay, yeah, I think you're right. Free. I mean, because I think like I'm a moderator on the Reddit Cooperatives page, where a lot of just random people show up with questions about co-ops. And I'm pretty sure if we had like an 800 number that was like, do you have questions about worker co-ops or want to start one? Call this 800 number. It would be flooded. There would be 50 calls a day for sure. There's a lot of people out there looking for it, and a lot of people looking for people to talk to. Like that's the most common question on Reddit is, how do I find people in my area that I can talk to about this, or how do I get connected with other people? And so like I get tired of saying, do a search for your state name plus Cooperative Development Center, start there. But really, that's what's needed. And even on GEO, I feel like we kind of try to play this role, because we do get like people just sending us random emails with just random questions, because they came across our page or something, and we do our best to answer them. But I've had connected with a couple of people who were just so happy to just talk to a person. Like, even if I couldn't answer really any of their questions, or only had a few useful things to offer, it was like somebody else who also knows that this is a thing and is supportive, like just that in and of itself, I think
and no paywall.
And no paywall. Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Though somebody's got to pay for it sometimes.
Well,
I
isn't
agree.
that at Dawn, didn't they do the sliding scale?
They had
right?
a sliding scale, right? Because they were trying to make sure they could continue to do it, right? So they needed to pay an organizer, and they wanted to pay the peer educators a little bit, right? So I think they charged a sliding scale, or figure out some other income generation way to do it. I was thinking maybe GEO should have an open session. I don't know. Can SteamYard do it, or would it have to be on Zoom or something? Anyway, once a month or so, we would have a link, and anybody who has a question for a GEO person, or a question about any of the articles we just posted, could call in or something. It could be interesting. But we're already a volunteer organization, so I guess trying to find one of us to volunteer our time to do that too. But on the other hand, if we had some other income generation strategy, and then could put it toward paying ourselves to do that kind of a service, that also could make sense. So trying to figure out where we can make income, and then use it to make sure this kind of a thing is free or very low cost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That is the conundrum that we run into, and we definitely had at GEO a lot, is like, because you want to make all the information free for everybody and as widely available as possible, but you do also have to pay the bills at some point, and you got to bridge that gap. I think fortunately now there's more options for doing that through things like Patreon and that kind of model, where some people with the means can contribute to you, and others can get it gratis. And we've done that with our webinars. We had when I did our webinar about the food co-ops, some people paid $50 for a ticket, and then a lot of people, half of the people were there, got a free ticket, and it all worked out, and we made plenty of money, and everybody who wanted to be there could be there. So
well, don't say plenty of money. We made some income off of it. Plenty of money to me sounds like thousands, hundred thousands of dollars. That's not what we made off of it. But we covered our costs, and we made a little income, right?
I know this one group that they provide a very important service for people, very, very essential service. And what they do is they find ways for the people who are more privileged to like pay extra, but it's all voluntary,
right?
And it subsidizes people who can't pay anything, and they've been going on many years now. It works, and they're like leveling up. So maybe stuff like that too.
Yeah. I think that's what, when Josh was saying the sliding scale fees, I think that's what we see those as, right? You give people options for how much they can afford, and you hope that the people who can afford more will pay the higher amount for what you're doing, and that will subsidize. And we tried that for a couple of years for the Eastern Conference also, and it worked. We also had to raise some money, but it did work. The people who could afford it did come through and pay more than their share.
Yeah, that kind of pay it forward model. I've seen restaurants that do that as well. Like, you can like pay for an additional meal, like with your meal, and then they just have like I saw it was like they had a receipt board. They had like a tack board with a bunch of receipts on it, and if you couldn't pay for a meal, you just go up and grab one of the receipts that's already been paid for.
Oh, that's very cool. Yeah. Huh. Wow.
But yeah, more of these kind of models, because I do think there's a need out there. I know there's a need that's not being met from people who just don't have connections with other co-op people, and they're
Right.
interested, or they've got one or
Right.
two friends maybe that are into it, but they don't know anybody, and they're just kind of out there in the ocean. So
Yeah.
Chris, did you
Thanks
have
for the
anything else?
article. I just want to thank Jessica for the article. It
Oh,
was nice to see it.
you're welcome.
Mhm.
I was
Yeah.
happy to write it. I was trying to think about what reflection I could do. And I guess, I'm always a teacher. So I thought it's a teachable moment for how I feel like what we learned, what the trajectory was and what we learned from it. So thanks for thanking me.
Yeah, it's great to have it someplace like for posterity, because I've heard the story, or I'd heard versions of the story. I hadn't heard
Right.
all the little bits and pieces before, but I'd heard it before. But yeah, now it's like it's out there for everybody. It's now official. Everybody knows. We get the praise and the blame for starting the USFWC. No, I'm joking. There are lots of people involved,
But it's
um,
also important for people to understand planning, right? Because sometimes planning gets a bad word, right? People think, oh, don't overthink it, don't plan it, just let it happen or whatever. But really, it was an organizing feat, and I really wanted to make sure people understood that there was strategy, there was organizing involved at every single level. And that it didn't, it's not like one person just woke up one morning and said, let's do it, and it happened, right? People put in a lot of different time, effort, strategy. Um, and I think we need to remember that too. Oh, God, Matt's asking a hard question. How long do we go?
as long as you want, Jessica. How long it takes you to answer this question? Is there a worker cooperative movement in the U.S. today? Oh, he's asking the movement question. Is this really a movement, or are we just, patting ourselves on the back? Are we trying to make much of something? I don't know. What do you think?
I hate that question.
Matt also said laugh out loud.
Yes.
Yeah, he probably knew I was going to say I hate that question. And you guys can answer too. It's not just me. I would say yes, but okay, I'm not one of those people. I have people who can spout off all the requirements of something to be a movement, and I can't do that. So I can't go through all the requirements and say how we've met them. If you guys can, you can do that. I would say the reason why I think there's a movement is because of all the activity that I can track from over the last 25 years, right? So starting with, very few worker co-ops, almost, only a cult of people even knew about them in the US, to now we have a lot more happening. We have at least 10 to 12 cities promoting, and putting money into worker co-ops. We've got more worker co-ops sprouting up. We've got, the US Federation and Dowie Democracy at Work Institute that are raising millions of dollars, right? So I think, and that, as I said, worker co-ops are one of the faster growing sectors of the co-op movement in the US. To me, all that says there's a movement. And then there's groups of us, actually different factions, right? To me, that also is a good sign that it's a movement, right? There's some different factions. Some of us argue with each other about certain strategies and outcomes and things like that. So to me, all that means it's a movement, because I've seen growth, continuous, sustained growth over at least 25 years. I know there was a lot of, not a lot, but there was probably the 70s was probably another period where there were a lot of worker co-ops, and that petered out. It looks like this time we might be sustaining the movement more than from well, it's already more than a decade, right? So yeah, if you think about time, growth, development, I feel like there's a movement, but I don't feel like there's a, what's the word? We're still a little fragmented, right? Because there's a bunch of us who say we're in the movement, but I'm not sure we all agree on exactly the same things of what the values are of the movement, or even what the hope for outcomes, right? Because some of us, I think in GEO, right, I'm one of those who I value the worker co-op structure, not for itself, but for where it can take us as human beings and as a society, right? And I'm interested in worker co-ops taking over capitalism if possible, right? But I don't know that everybody in the worker co-op movement agrees with that or believes that or is involved in a worker co-op for that reason.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult question. I'll kind of dodge it by saying I think there's a movement, and there will continue to be a movement in the larger economy towards worker co-ops because of late stage capitalism hollowing everything out, sucking all the value out of everything. So just today, posted an article or a gleaning from about veterinary cooperatives. Next big thing, because why are all of a sudden veterinarians as a group talking about worker co-ops? Because of private equity has been taking over, buying all their practices and oppressing and exploiting everybody. And this is how the rest of the economy is going. And so I think the movement for worker co-ops is not going to come from us. It's not from cooperators. Like, it's from people who have never cared about or thought about co-ops before, and all of a sudden their job is being put at risk, or they've been fired, or they've got a big pay cut or whatever, and they look for something else. And fortunately now I think that there is enough information online that it's not that hard to stumble across this alternate model. So I think we'll continue to see that. Whether or not we who are already cooperators are an actual movement, I mean, I think it depends. I know some people who are worker co-op, in worker co-ops, and definitely don't think of themselves as part of any movement at all. They think of themselves as a part owner of a business. That's it. So, for them, there is no worker co-op movement, or they're not part of it anyway. Even though they're a worker owner, and we might want to count them. But then, yeah, there are others of us who are, actually do have some kind of social transformative goals, or at least that we're pushing towards. So yeah, I don't know if we're technically a movement or not. I think it doesn't really matter. We're coming up one way or another.
I was laughing at what Matt wrote in the private comment, which is, see, it was a good question.
There you
go. But on that topic though of the worker co-ops having within the potential for greater things, we do have 2 live streams where we try to push that conversation forward. It's GEO Live number 3, which is what's so special about worker co-ops, and GEO Live number 8, Solidarity Economy and Transformative Change. I think we need to have another one.
Good job, Chris, of reminding people that GEO does keep talking about these issues, driving people back to some of our content. I like that. I think I'm just about done.
Gonna turn into a pumpkin, eh?
Yeah. I need to have some dinner.
Okay, well, it's been wonderful. Thanks so much for coming on, Jessica, and hopefully you can come on to another one of these, or maybe we'll snag you for a Reddit Q&A someday. Or maybe we'll take you up on your idea of doing another stream where we have people come on and ask us questions, or ask you guys questions. But at any rate, that's all for a later time. we'll say goodnight and thanks. I guess
Thanks, everyone. Great talking with you guys. Thanks, Matt.